In this presentation, I'll be talking about motivation and fluency instruction. Before watching this video, you should complete the preceding reading and activity related to motivational factors. You may also want to have the note-taking sheet for this presentation on hand. In the next few minutes, we'll explore specific approaches that can be used to address motivational factors when helping adult learners develop their fluency. We'll cover how to help students see their progress and how to set up authentic purposes for repeated reading. As you may have experienced or can imagine, reading the same text again and again may be boring for adult learners if the activity is not framed in a way that is meaningful to them. As teachers, we want to always keep the motivational factors in mind as we plan fluency instruction. Let's start by thinking about setting and tracking goals. For some learners, focusing on fluency goals or targets and seeing progress in those areas provides the motivation they need to persevere with repeated readings. Concretely tracking the improvement they make with each repeated reading can be helpful. A form like this one is useful. Note that it has places to record the date, the title of the text, what the fluency target is, and that would be accurate reading, rate, expression, and then space for making notes or recording times for each reading. The first reading often sets the baseline and is done individually by the learner, and then the fourth reading serves as an assessment. How much better did the learner do with practice? Hopefully, the learner will see progress by the last reading. Let's see how this form can work. This form shows that Philip read several pages from The Big Goof on January 10th. This form is intended to be used with students, so you may not want to record the readability level of the text, especially if it's provided in grade level. However, if you are using a reading program that levels text in other ways, like by using designations like level A, B, C, there is a benefit to adding the level to the form. That way, students can see their progress over time. Now let's see what Philip was working on related to fluency. The third column indicates that his goal was word accuracy and attending to periods. Note that Philip may not be able to read these fluency target words on the form at first, but they will become sight words as he sees these words again and again as you use the form. Over here, the teacher, tutor, or the learner can record notes after each reading. The teacher or tutor should reflect with the learner after each reading and make notes like you see here. Learners at the very lowest level may need to dictate to the teacher or tutor when they first begin, but other learners can be encouraged to make their own notes. Students working in pairs on repeated readings can work together to fill in the columns as well. The suggested rating scale can be adapted as needed, but the idea is to help the learner see in concrete terms that he or she is making progress, and to be able to look back at the form over time and see that the repeated readings make a difference. Seeing concrete evidence of progress builds learner self-efficacy and helps them to more accurately evaluate their own fluency as they develop as readers. Let's look at another student's form. Juanita's targets are to work on rate and phrasing. Notice how the notes provide feedback on both. WCPM refers to words correct per minute. There are several ways to calculate WCPM, but one of the easiest is to set a timer for 60 seconds and note where the student is in the text at that point. You can have the student either keep reading while you note her place at the 60-second point, or she can stop reading. Once she has finished each reading, all you or she has to do is count the words up to the 60-second mark. The next time she tries to go further. Instead of recording WCPM, you might also just time how long it takes the learner to read a set amount of text and record the time for each one, like we saw in a previous video. The point is to have a visual way of tracking student progress. Let's look at some other specific ways to address motivational factors in repeated reading. The remaining approaches that we'll talk about involve framing repeated readings in terms of something the learners do to accomplish something that matters to them. There are at least 4 general approaches to ramp up the purposefulness of repeated readings. These are reading to children, using the language experience approach, performance reading, and beating the clock. Let's look at each of these in turn. Some adult learners want to improve their reading because they want to be able to read to their children or grandchildren, as we saw in the videos in the last section. Because this is a motivating goal for these learners, framing repeated reading as preparing to read a book to a child provides a rationale for practicing the reading of the book multiple times. Once the learner is able to read the children's book to his child or grandchild, then that book can become something he reads and rereads to that child. Because, as you might know, children often request to have the same book read over and over again to them. These ongoing readings then provide further opportunities for the learner to become more familiar with the words, more adept with the phrasing, and more expressive as he seeks to make the book enjoyable for the child. In preparing to read to children, there's a process that you can keep in mind. The first is to invite the learner to select a children's book. If possible, invite the learner to choose between at least 2 books. Have him consider what the target child would find most interesting, if that's helpful. In a class situation, students might all prepare the same book, hopefully one that they all agree on. Remember that having choice, as we heard about in the last section, having choice fosters motivation. You'll also want to frame the lesson in terms of preparing to read to the child. Emphasize the need to read at a natural rate, to read smoothly, and to read with phrasing and/or expression, whatever the fluency target is. Next, you'll want to break the book into sets of pages. Most children's books are likely too long to be read all at once in a lesson, which should usually last only 10 to 15 minutes. Think about the amount of time that was used in the tutoring videos in the last section. It may take several lessons then, covering a few pages each lesson, for a learner to feel ready to read a whole book to a child. The next step is to use explicit instruction to work through each set of pages that you've identified. Remember, these are to explain what the fluency target is and why it's important, to be sure to model fluent reading, provide at least 3 opportunities for the learner to read a set of pages being covered in the lesson through guided practice, and then at the end of each lesson, invite the learner to read the set of pages independently and assess the improvement. In a class situation, as opposed to a scenario that involves just one tutor or teacher and a student, paired reading can be incorporated. This would involve students reading to each other instead of each reading to the teacher, and they would provide feedback to each other. The teacher might first need to model reading the targeting pages and then have pairs practice with each other. Alternatively, learners in a class might record themselves and evaluate the first and last recording. The teacher then would walk around the room providing feedback as they practice. Do be sure to discuss the content of the set of pages being read for each lesson after you model the first reading. Learners need to be sure to understand the story so that they can better be able to focus on fluent reading. Also, at the beginning of each lesson, have the learner read the sets of pages already practiced to get up to the point of the next lesson. At least do that if you have time. Doing so will provide additional practice in reading that text and learning those words, and foster interest in the developing story. Be sure to prompt predictions by asking such questions as, what do you think will happen next? Why? These are the same kinds of questions that we would hope that they would ask the child when they're reading, so it's good to go ahead and model that. Lastly, of course, invite the learner to read the book to the child at home and report back. When the whole book has been practiced, each learner should then read the book to her child. In a class setting, if each learner has practiced a different book, it's possible to add another step of having the learner read the book to the class or to a peer. Doing so exposes all the learners to a range of texts that they may want to prepare in the future to share with their children. Another approach to use with beginning adult learners is the language experience approach, or LEA. The LEA works especially well to help students with word accuracy and rate, but it can be used to emphasize phrasing and expression as well. This approach, as you might imagine, also involves multiple steps. First, engage the learners in an experience like a field trip, a guest speaker, some kind of an activity, or ask them to recall an important events from their own lives. The purpose here is to have something interesting that the learners want to share with others. Next, invite learners to write down their recollection of the experience. This can be handled in a variety of ways. In a class setting, work as a large group to write the story. Each individual student can provide one sentence at a time for the class to tweak as the teacher writes it down on a whiteboard or types it up on a smart board or a projected Word document. Alternatively, in one-on-one situations or very small classes where it's manageable, the learners can write down their individual experiences themselves, like in a journal, if they're far enough along with their reading and writing. This approach is especially effective when learners are sharing cultural traditions, family histories, autobiographies, things that they want to share with families and friends over time. As they write, they can use their knowledge of phonics and invented spelling, where they spell the best they can based on the sounds to spell the words, or a volunteer tutor can assist. The teacher or volunteer can then edit the text to use standard spelling. In pair writing, a pair of students work together to write down their recollection of an experience. Again, this can be a field trip, a guest speaker, something like that. This approach works best if it follows experiences with writing class stories, which we discussed first, because those can serve as models. As with the learner journal, a teacher or volunteer may need to check for standard spelling before moving to the next step. You will want to encourage learners to think of someone they want to share the story with, such as a child or a grandchild or even other students. You might actually do this step before you start writing, so students have their audience in mind as they create the story. Frame the lesson then in terms of being able to share the experience with the selected audience, or to record it as part of a personal diary or a journal. You might want to explain your own experience with a journal, or just emphasize that the point is to help a person remember key events from their life, because those can be fun to read and reread. Then use that text that you've developed in steps 1 through 2 for guided, repeated oral reading. Again, you will want to use the steps of explicit instruction: explain, as you'll recall, model, and providing guided practice. The ultimate independent application will be for them to read the text to whoever their audience is and then report back how it went. Lastly, add the prepared text to a notebook, or the learner might think of it as a journal, for future reading. Learners should be encouraged to reread the items in their developing notebook or journal regularly. That will reinforce the new words they have learned and help them to become more fluent with each new reading. In addition to preparing to read to children or preparing an LEA experience to share with family and friends, preparing performance readings can motivate adult learners as well. Performance readings are rather formal activities in which learners read aloud a text for a class or a community audience. They are especially helpful for focusing students on phrasing and expression, or what we call prosody. The instructional process looks something like this. First, the learner selects a text. This could be a poem or a song. Those might be chosen by individual or pairs of students to read to the class during designated times. For instance, students might sign up for the last 5 minutes of the day to share a text that is meaningful to them, and this sharing time becomes a regular part of class. Another kind of text appropriate for performance reading is a script. This can be from a play or even a TV show or a movie. It's important to remember, though, that memorization is not the focus here. Instead, a group might present the text as a reader's theater, which is much like a radio show from days gone by. In reader's theater, performers actually read the text. They don't memorize it during the performance, but they do read it as if they are acting. In reader's theater, there are opportunities for both individuals and groups to read designated lines, so it can be fun to prepare. After this presentation, you can view an example of reader's theater, so look for that in the following section. You can also use text created from a language experience approach or another kind of group writing exercise. These can be especially powerful if you have an open house in your program or have a board that likes to know what students in your program are doing. The length of the text depends on the number of students performing and the purpose. As I mentioned earlier, classes can have students sign up for performance readings. In this case, learners should be coached to choose short pieces. If a group is working together, they can tackle longer pieces because they can split up the text into manageable chunks and read it like a reader's theater. After choosing the text, or having students choose the text, the next step is to use explicit instruction to engage learners in repeated readings as a practice for the performance. Because this is an often public event, learners should want to do their best. It's helpful for the teacher or fellow students, of course, to provide feedback on phrasing and expression, so it will be their best work when it's done. The final step is for students to perform for the target audience, explaining why they like the text or why it's important to them, if that's appropriate. A target audience might be the learner's class, another class, or friends or family invited in for a special event. When individual or pairs of learners are presenting a self-selected text to the class as a regular event, it would be an appropriate time for them to share why the text is significant. The last specific approach we'll explore is beating the clock. Beat the clock, or beating the clock, works well for learners who need to work on rate. Adapting techniques discussed in the last video, in the previous section, learners time themselves in an initial reading, and they can use a stopwatch app on their cell phones or a clock. They then practice reading at least 3 times with a tape, in a duet reading situation with a teacher or tutor, or just on their own. And then they time themselves reading one more time and compare their time with the first reading. Some students are competitive and will find this approach motivating. You can incorporate the fluency tracking sheet for those students or some other kind of log to help them see for themselves how they are improving over time. Okay. So in this presentation, we have covered how to track progress in fluency using something like the fluency tracking sheet, and how to frame repeated readings with authentic purposes. Take a few minutes now, if you would, to explore the links to the handouts and the online resources, and then feel free to move on to the next section.